Welcome to the Harris County Flood Control District's virtual community engagement meeting to discuss the Vince Bayou Drainage Improvements Project. This virtual community meeting is being offered by the Flood Control District to share vital information with the community and to gather your input on flood risk reduction efforts in your area. Community engagement is a critical component of our work, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us this evening. My name is Robert Fricke with the Flood Control District Communications team. I am joined tonight by a team of Flood Control District leadership and subject matter experts to ensure we continue to keep you up to date on important flood mitigation efforts. We are glad to see the community engaged with this project and look forward to gathering your feedback tonight. Moving forward, we will continue to share updates on this and other projects in your area to keep you involved and informed. First, we would like to begin tonight's meeting with remarks from Harris County Precinct 2 Commissioner Adrian Garcia.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Adrian Garcia, Harris County Precinct 2 Commissioner. Thank you to the Harris County Flood Control District for hosting this event this evening. Before we begin, I want to send a sincere thank you to everyone for taking time to join us this evening. I want you, our Precinct 2 residents, to know that we are already and still working hard for you, and we're excited to start the new year with brand new and exciting projects. Tonight, you're here to learn about a project that reduces flooding in our community. You know that this is a top concern for families who have been repeatedly impacted by flooding in their neighborhoods. As a part of my new Revive to Thrive initiative, this flood prevention effort will help protect your community and make a major step toward ensuring that there are fair and equitable opportunities for communities throughout Precinct 2. With Revive to Thrive, our goal is to focus on revitalization rather than to allow gentrification to create the benefits that you have long been asking for. We do this by empowering communities and creating opportunities for our existing neighborhoods to be more resilient, inclusive, and thriving. With the right investments, resources, infrastructure, commitment, and community involvement, we can all progress and thrive. And Harris County works best when all communities are thriving. I'm proud to be born and raised in Precinct 2, and I want everyone to know this community is a great place to live, work, and play. This is one of the many flood mitigation projects happening in Precinct 2 aimed at improving our drainage systems to help minimize the impact of major rain events. We are aware that residents in this community experienced flooding during Tropical Storm Allison and, of course, record levels during Hurricane Harvey. This project is intended to help prevent a repeat of those outcomes. Quality infrastructure is not only my responsibility as your county commissioner, but also one of my top priorities. Therefore, I've directed my team to take action and demonstrate real progress to address our community's needs with projects that make a difference and make you and us better prepared to weather the next storm. I hope you continue to stay engaged in this process. It's important because you need to remember that your voice, your experiences, and your opinions absolutely do matter. Again, we're thankful that you've joined us tonight. If you need to get in touch with my office, please visit our website at hcp2.com or call us at 713-274-2222 or follow us on all of the social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, yes, even TikTok. Our doors are always open, and my team and I are always happy to support you in whatever we can. Thank you all, and have a great meeting tonight.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia. We appreciate you sharing remarks. This virtual public meeting will begin with a presentation to share project updates, including an overview of the Vince Bayou Watershed Planning Study, the resulting project, timelines, and next steps. The presentation will be followed by a virtual question and answer session with Flood Control District team members, where we'll respond to your questions and comment on some of the frequently asked questions we receive from the public. Attendees will be able to submit comments and questions through the website or by phone. Any comments not addressed during the Q&A session will receive a response from the Flood Control District after the close of the comment period. Instructions on how to participate in the virtual meeting are included on this slide, on this virtual meeting webpage, and on the Flood Control District's website. I will also share a reminder of these instructions when we reach the Q&A portion of the meeting. Also note that this full presentation is available in Spanish on publicinput.com meeting page. We will now transition to Gary Besmick, Planning Department Manager and with the Flood Control District, who will share information about the Flood Control District and this project. Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Robert, and a special thanks to each of you for joining us. In this presentation, we will give a brief overview of this project. Before we get to the project specifics, we want to share a bit of background about the Flood Control District. The Harris County Flood Control District is a special purpose district created by the Texas legislature in 1937 in response to devastating floods that hit the Houston area in 1929 and 1935. The Flood Control District is governed by the Harris County Commissioners Court and works closely with other entities in our region, such as the Harris County Engineering Department and the City of Houston. The organization was created in part to serve as a local partner to leverage federal funding for flood damage reduction projects. Our mission has expanded since our founding, leading to billions of dollars in federal, state, and locally funded infrastructure improvements in the ground. The mission of the Harris County Flood Control District is to provide flood damage reduction projects that work with appropriate regard for community and natural values. One of the most difficult challenges we face is constructing effective projects that are sensitive to community and natural values in a highly urbanized area. Harris County includes 23 main watersheds, totaling approximately 1,800 square miles and more than 2,500 linear miles of channel. 2,500 miles is approximately the distance from New York to California. A watershed is a geographical region of land that drains to a common channel or outlet. Each watershed has its own unique characteristics and needs. The project we are presenting tonight is in the Vince Bayou watershed, which is located in southeast Harris County. Harris County and our surrounding area is flood prone for a number of reasons. Namely, we experience extreme rainfall events, including tropical storms and hurricanes. Our area is largely made up of flat, slow draining land, and we see large concentrations of clay soils that do not soak up excess rainfall quickly. While the Flood Control District plays a critical role in flood risk reduction, we are one of several entities involved in these efforts in our region. When rain falls on your roof, it flows through several jurisdictions, such as streets and drains, managed by the Harris County Engineering Department, a municipal utility district, or a city, such as the City of Pasadena, before it flows into a larger channel, creek, or bayou that the Flood Control District owns and maintains. This slide illustrates the various jurisdictions, which sometimes we even share with other entities. Inside neighborhoods, as shown on the left side of this illustration, storm sewers and roadside ditches collect stormwater runoff and start the process of moving it away from homes and streets. Storm sewers and roadside ditches are the responsibility of the underlying municipality. The larger bayous and channels that take the collected stormwater and move it through our drainage system to Galveston Bay are the responsibility of the Flood Control District. This is shown on the right side of the illustration. In the middle is a stormwater detention basin, sometimes constructed by the Flood Control District. When storm sewers on the left are increased, this creates an increase in runoff. Since it is our policy to avoid any adverse impacts from our projects, detention basins help to safely take in and temporarily store excess stormwater during heavy rain events. Often, we partner with Harris County precincts, utility districts, and others to add recreational amenities, such as trails to these basins and along our channels. On August 25th, 2018, Harris County voters approved $2.5 billion in bonds for flood risk reduction projects. This vote followed a series of 23 meetings with community members across Harris County, one per watershed, which resulted in a list of what is now 181 bond projects. 38 of those projects were added directly as a result of community input. The actual timing of each individual project will depend on a variety of factors, including environmental permitting, right-of-way acquisition and utility relocation, and in some cases, the requirements of a particular grant. Project lists and projected schedules are updated regularly on our website. As bond projects move forward, we're making significant progress towards resilience in Harris County. We shared an update with Harris County Commissioners Court in January of this year and highlighted a few notable stats. 27 projects completed or closed, $1.43 billion in partnership funding secured to stretch the bond funds even further for our community, and more than 180 community engagement meetings hosted, ensuring conversations with you continue. Your input continues to be critical to our efforts. We'll continue these biannual updates moving forward to share progress on the program. While the bond was for $2.5 billion, the full cost of every project in the bond tables is almost $5 billion. So we made it clear from the outset that we would need funding partners to fully construct the projects in the bond program. As I mentioned, we've had some success so far, having secured more than $1.35 billion in partner funds for projects across Harris County. And this graphic illustrates the many sources of those partnerships, including federal, state, and local funding that Flood Control District is working to secure for Harris County. Each agency has its own definition of eligible projects and its own requirements for local match funding, so the Flood Control District works diligently to match projects to the right partnership opportunities. We will now move into the part of the program that is specifically about the Vince Bayou Watershed and Vince Bayou Drainage Improvements Project. As a reminder, we are looking for your input as we discuss the project in more detail. Please feel free to drop any questions or comments into the comment box or to comment via phone by pushing the star key. The Vince Bayou Drainage Improvements Project aims to reduce the impact of flooding throughout the Vince Bayou watershed through what are expected to be multiple channel conveyance improvement and stormwater detention basin projects along the main stem of Vince Bayou. Channel conveyance improvements and stormwater detention were recommended by the Vince Bayou Watershed Planning Study, which was completed in 2021. The purpose of today's meeting is to share with you details on the Vince Bayou Watershed Planning Study as the Vince Bayou Drainage Improvements Project enters preliminary engineering. The map on the screen shows Harris County limits in black and the Vince Bayou Watershed in red. While the project we are here to discuss is the first project in the watershed funded by the bond program, there have been other improvement projects completed by the Flood Control District on or near Little Vince Bayou. The city of Pasadena also has several projects underway as part of their drainage mitigation and stormwater detention program. You can contact the city of Pasadena for more information on those projects. The map on this screen shows the project boundaries for the Vince Bayou Watershed Planning Study in red, which was the entirety of the Vince Bayou Watershed. Vince Bayou Watershed covers about 16 square miles and includes two primary streams, Vince Bayou and Little Vince Bayou. Vince Bayou flows from Genoa Red Bluff Road to the Houston Ship Channel, and Little Vince Bayou drains the remaining third of the watershed. There are about 19 miles of open streams within the watershed, including the primary streams and tributary channels. There are a few key characteristics of the watershed to keep in mind as we move forward in our presentation. Over 95% of the land in the watershed is considered flat or very flat. The watershed is highly developed with very few open areas of significant sizes. The majority of the main channels for Vince Bayou and Little Vince Bayou are man-made and primarily concrete lined. There are some tributaries to the primary channels which are grass lined, but these are more like drainage ditches. This planning study investigated flooding problems, identified ongoing and proposed flood mitigation projects, and evaluated and recommended potential projects to reduce the risk of flooding in this watershed. This effort resulted in a watershed-wide plan for major stormwater infrastructure improvements. Taking a watershed-wide approach to planning ensures that future flood risk reduction projects work together and are sequenced appropriately to achieve the maximum benefits. Planners worked with Harris County, the City of Pasadena, the City of Houston, and other agencies, both to clarify flooding issues in the watershed and to improve coordination between flood control district regional projects and future local projects. The Vince Bayou Watershed Planning Study was funded by Harris County, the Texas General Land Office of the State of Texas, and the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development through the Community Development Block Grant Program. Before we get into the study findings, I want to take a few minutes to cover some of the terms we will be using. Some of these you may have heard, but I think it will be beneficial to clarify some of the terminology. Throughout the presentation, we will be using terms like 100-year event and annual chance event. I want to clarify what that means. A 1% annual chance event or 100-year event is a rainfall event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. That doesn't mean that if you have a 1% annual chance event this year, you are good for another 100 years. It is simply a measure of the expected frequency based on the historical data that we have. By the same token, a 10% annual chance or 10-year event is a rainfall event that has a 10% chance of occurring in any given year. Further examples are shown in this slide. I think it is important to remind you that the precipitation depths for each of the specified frequencies are based on statistical data and they are not related to each other. For instance, a 10-year event does not have 5 times as much rainfall as a 2-year event, and a 100-year storm does not have 10 times the rainfall of a 10-year storm. Here you see another map of Vince Bayou Watershed showing channel capacity. Vince Bayou Watershed has been impacted by multiple flood events, including 28 of the 46 largest events in Harris County since 1979. As shown on this map, the Vince Bayou Watershed has greater than 100-year capacity in some areas, but still has less than 100-year capacity in many stretches, particularly along its main stem. There are multiple sources of flooding in the watershed, including local stormwater drainage limitations, which are caused by insufficient storm sewer inlets, an undersized storm sewer network, and/or a lack of overflow outlets for extreme events. Diversions of sheet flow or channel overflow from adjoining watershed areas caused by insufficient drainage systems or channel capacity in the adjoining watershed areas. And finally, channel overbank flooding due to insufficient channel conveyance capacity of Vince Bayou and its tributaries. The clusters of historic flooding claims and possible flooding sources were carefully studied to identify various localized problem areas in the watershed. By determining where the most severe flooding problems exist, we help to ensure that our proposed flood reduction strategy benefits the most people within a limited budget. Once existing and potential future problems were identified across the watershed, the study team refined conceptual solutions to help mitigate flooding in select areas. There are various techniques the Flood Control District typically deploys to help reduce flooding in a project area. We call this our flood mitigation toolbox. It is important to find the right type and right configuration for each project. I'd like to take a moment to walk through the various tools in this toolbox. First of all, channel modifications have long been used by the Flood Control District and other entities, such as the United States Army Corps of Engineers, to reduce the risk of flooding. And it's a broad category, from full channel rectification of a channel to providing some modification to side slopes. Stormwater detention is also an effective mitigation tool. The concept is simple: temporarily store floodwater to provide relief to the channels downstream. Stormwater detention is more cost-effective when the drainage area is smaller. As the drainage area gets larger, more and more storage volume is required to obtain the same benefit. That is why you will not typically see a stormwater detention basin, say, along the San Jacinto River. It is common to pair channel modifications in a reach with stormwater detention basins to mitigate increased flow. Less common tools include channel diversions and bridge adjustments. Diversions are only available when there is a location to divert floodwater to that will not cause adverse impacts. Bridge adjustments and/or replacements can remove an impediment to flow, and they are often implemented as part of a larger suite of initiatives. But a bridge replacement can also result in additional flow downstream, requiring it to be paired with a stormwater detention basin. Finally, last is acquisitions or buyouts in the floodplain, which is simply purchasing flood-prone properties and assisting the owners in relocating to a home on higher ground. It is not always the most popular option, but it is sometimes the best option, especially when there are safety hazards to residents and first responders. The proposed flood mitigation strategy from the watershed planning study for Vince Bayou consists of stormwater detention basins at 5 different locations throughout the watershed, with associated channel widening at 2 of the proposed basins. The detention basins under consideration are generally located near the Vince Bayou main channel in the upper reaches of the watershed above Spencer Highway. Channel widening is proposed at 2 of the 5 detention basin sites for a combined widening reach length of about 0.7 miles. Combined, the 5 basins would be able to detain approximately 233 acre-feet of flood volume. Since the recommended project includes multiple components, we have flexibility in execution. The basins can be combined into a single project or a combination of multiple projects, since these basins are generally independent of one another. Let's take a moment to further explain how stormwater detention basins work in flood mitigation. Stormwater detention basins provide storage for runoff of floodwaters. This storage is temporary and prevents water from overwhelming channels. When channel stormwater levels drop back down, the stored stormwater drains back into the channel by gravity via outfall pipes appropriately sized to drain the basin. While all stormwater detention basins essentially function the same way, they can be designed in many different configurations. Stormwater detention basins can be designed as either wet bottom or dry bottom. Wet bottom basins feature a permanent pool of water at the bottom of the basin. The area from the top of the water to the top of the basin's banks is available for additional stormwater storage. Dry bottom basins are grass-lined and are designed to drain dry between rain events. We are pursuing dry bottom basins for this project. When we talk about stormwater detention basins, we talk about how much stormwater they can hold in a unit of measure called acre-feet. That measure refers to the volume of water 1 foot deep over 1 acre. For context, 1 acre-foot equals 325,851 gallons. Think of 1 football field covered with 1 foot of water. Combined, the 5 proposed basins proposed by the Vince Bayou Watershed Planning Study would be able to detain approximately 233 acre-feet of flood volume. This total capacity translates to roughly 75 million gallons, or roughly 230 football fields of storage. This brings us to where we are today. The visual on this slide shows the typical project life cycle of a flood risk reduction project. While every flood risk reduction project is unique, they all have a common life cycle. Each project begins and ends with predictable milestones along the way. In the case of this project, the Vince Bayou Watershed Planning Study served as the feasibility stage for the Vince Bayou Drainage Improvement Project. If you would like to review the Watershed Planning Study, you can visit the Vince Bayou section of our website at www.hcfcd.org/Vince. The project is now in the early preliminary engineering stage of its project lifecycle, as indicated by the arrow on the screen. Preliminary engineering is an important stage in the development of a project in which we conduct a detailed evaluation of the potential projects. During this stage, flood control district engineers and environmental specialists develop and evaluate possible alternatives for the identified project to meet flood damage reduction goals. This includes analyzing the benefits for the 5 stormwater detention basins identified in the watershed planning study and prioritizing the projects for implementation accordingly. Ultimately, one project is recommended at the conclusion of this project stage in a document called the Preliminary Engineering Report, or PER for short. The recommended project at the end of the PER could be a single detention basin or a combination of multiple detention basins and channel improvements. Performance metrics will be used to determine the recommended project along with community input. We will look for the improvements that are the most feasible and cost-effective to construct while minimizing environmental impacts and maximizing flood risk reduction benefits. To recap, the next steps for the Vince Bayou Drainage Improvements Project as part of the preliminary engineering stage include developing and evaluating possible alternatives, determining potential utility relocations or property acquisitions, developing cost estimates for design and construction, and preparing the final preliminary engineering report. Bond Project ID F-104 provides $15 million in funding for this project. This funding will cover the cost of the PER with money left over to move forward with select alternatives from the PER. The anticipated completion date of the preliminary engineering stage is December 2023. I will now turn the program back over to Robert to kick off the question and answer session.
Thanks, Gary. Before we move into the Q&A, I want to share a quick reminder that we're looking for your input. We'd love to hear from you on this and other projects moving forward across Harris County. Your input is critical as we continue to develop project plans for this and other flood risk reduction efforts. All comments and questions received this evening will be considered as we develop plans for this effort, but the conversation doesn't end here. To learn more about this project, ask questions, and sign up for our mailing list, please visit hcfcd.org/F104. As a reminder, there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project during tonight's session. Submit a comment on this site in the box near the presentation live stream. Submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/F104, or submit a comment via phone at 855-925-2801, utilizing meeting code 3872. If you are joining us via phone tonight, please press star to leave a message. Additionally, I want to reiterate that any questions not addressed during tonight's Q&A will receive a response from the Flood Control District following the close of the comment period. Information from this meeting and a recording of the live stream will be available on the Flood Control District's website and YouTube channel. Also note that this full presentation is available in Spanish on the publicinput.com meeting page. Joining Gary for our Q&A session tonight are David Parkhill and Jonathan St. Romain. Now it's time to take some of your questions. All right. Our first question for this evening is for Jonathan. Jonathan, how was this project identified?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this project, which as Gary mentioned is bond ID F-104, was identified by the Vince Bayou Watershed Feasibility Study or Watershed Planning Study. And this Vince Bayou Watershed Planning Study is one of two projects in the Vince Bayou watershed that were included in the 2018 bond program. And so this is a project within the 2018 bond program. And both of these projects were identified from previous countywide planning efforts and community input using factors such as historical flooding and funding availability.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next question for this evening is for David. David, what is the goal of this project?
Thank you, Robert, and good evening. The goal of the project, as Gary has explained, of the planning study was to identify projects that could be recommended to use the current bond funds. This project that's now in the PER stage is to further evaluate those recommendations and determine which and more details about those specific projects.
Thank you, David. Our next question is also for you, David. What is the exact area for this project?
So the planning study was, of course, for the entire watershed, and I did recommend projects throughout the watershed, but the limited budget was used to try to tailor projects that could be completed with that budget. And those projects are in generally the upper watershed, as Gary said, above or upstream from the Spencer Highway area. That area has less improvements. The lower watershed was improved by the Corps of Engineers decades ago. And so this project will be focused on that upper part of the watershed.
All right, thank you, David. Our next question for this evening is for Gary. Gary, if local stormwater drainage limitations are a cause for flooding, then why is our mitigation strategy not focused on improving this system?
Yes, thank you for that question. The mitigation strategy is focused on improving the overall system. The system, for lack of better wording, can be thought of as having two components. There's a local drainage system of stormwater pipes and drainage ditches. In this watershed, they are primarily owned and operated by the city of Pasadena. And then also part of the system is the larger tributary channels and main stem channels of Vince Bayou and Little Vince Bayou, which are owned and operated by the Flood Control District. In some areas, detention basins, which collect the stormwater and reduce peak flows into the system, can also be owned and operated by private entities like the city or the Flood Control District. The planning study evaluated all aspects of this system and includes recommendations for improvements which will have the most impact of reducing flooding. The city of Pasadena has specific projects planned and underway to improve their local drainage network, and the Flood Control District will be using the 2018 bond funding to improve the district system, which is the bigger channels. So basically, in a nutshell, when we did our planning study, we did look at trying to identify what all of the problems were in the watershed, which would include looking at local systems as well as the larger bayou systems. But we focused where we felt like the best benefits would be had, which would be looking at the major Vince Bayou system. And our analysis indicated that we could get quite a bit of benefit by focusing on those systems. So at the end of the planning study, that's what was recommended: a series of detention basins and channel modifications that, when all put together, produce a pretty good benefit. And that's the project that's being evaluated right now as part of the PER study.
Thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, You mentioned channel overflow from adjoining watersheds are causing flooding in the Vince Bayou watershed. Which watersheds are causing the problems, and how are you addressing those issues?
Right. So it depends, and it gets sort of complex when we start talking about water overflowing from one watershed to another. And in general, when we have underground storm sewer systems, those storm sewer systems were designed and built to take water into one particular direction. But in the case of heavy rain events, when you start to get ponding in streets, if those storm sewers get overwhelmed, sometimes when you get the higher water and ponding in the streets, that's when that flow can go in different directions, and it can spill over from one watershed divide to another. And Gary talked in the presentation about how flat this area is, and so that's a consequence of very flat land. Sometimes that water can sheet flow over into a different watershed. The watershed surrounding the Vince Bayou watershed are Sims Bayou to the west and Armand Bayou to the south. And there are smaller tributaries to the Houston Ship Channel to the east. And so really all of these adjoining watersheds have the potential to sort of overflow into the Vince Bayou watershed during some of these major storm events. The Flood Control District does have numerous projects underway in all of these adjoining watersheds, and you can learn more about those projects on our website.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. As a reminder, I just want to let everyone know that there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project during tonight's session. Submit a comment on this site in the box near the presentation live stream. You can submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/F104, or you can submit a comment via phone at 855-925-2801, utilizing meeting code 3872. And if you're joining us via phone tonight, please press star to leave a message. All right. Our next question is also for Jonathan. Jonathan, Jose Luis writes, we have had surveyors on our property. Do we have preliminary designs for those detention basins?
Yeah, great question. So I'll take the second one first. No, we do not have preliminary designs for these detention basins yet. And this is piggybacking a little bit on what Gary talked about in the presentation, that we are in the preliminary engineering stage of this project. And this is the stage where we look at our potential locations for these improvements and the various alternatives. And so we haven't gotten to the point yet to where we would do a final design of a detention basin project. And so you mentioned that you have surveyors out, or you've seen surveyors out along our channel, which is correct. That's one of the main things that we do in this preliminary engineering stage, is we have our sub-consultant teams of surveyors and underground utility exploration, and we do our hydraulic and hydrologic, the big modeling for our water flow and to look at the benefits of the project. We also have environmental teams that you may have seen out, and so they're the ones who go out and do the field work to determine where our wetlands are, because we have to follow environmental rules and regulations as it pertains to wetlands and threatened and endangered species and cultural resources. And so these are some of the folks that people may have seen out along the channel conducting their surveys. And then there's also traditional surveyors that are taking points and getting elevations of the ground so that we can then use all of that information in our storm modeling to determine which configuration of this project is best. And so that's just kind of a quick little summary of what you've seen, obviously out there in your area, is those folks doing the work for our preliminary engineering. And so no, we're not quite yet there to get design plans. Design stage will follow once our preliminary engineering is complete.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Our next question for this evening is from John. John is asking two questions here. The first one is, and I quote, "Did I understand correctly that projects being considered now will be north of Spencer Highway?"
Yeah, I'll take that question. Yes. So if you go back to the discussion we had about where these projects came from, which was the initial feasibility or watershed planning study, we studied the entirety of the watershed. We identified where we felt like the flooding issues were associated to local drainage issues. We did identify some areas where water is spilling from adjacent watersheds into Vince Bayou. And we also identified where channel would get out of banks because sections of the Vince and Little Vince systems were undersized. So when that water gets out of banks, it will tend to go overland. It'll create a floodplain. And in some areas, it may transfer water from Vince Bayou main stem to Little Vince Bayou. So what happens is water is moving throughout the watershed. So the reason we identified the projects that are going to the PER is they scored out as the best of the projects that we looked at. And keeping in mind, we have a specific budget within the bond ID to be able to move forward. So we selected the projects that we felt like would give us the most benefits relative to the entire watershed. There are other projects that we're still looking for funding that at some point we're going to have to figure out how we move forward with those. But for the ones that are currently moving forward, we're targeting detention and limited channel in the upper portion of Vince Bayou, because by holding and collecting that water, we get benefits that will continue down the stream, as well as we're able to contain water that under large events such as the 100-year or larger than that, we're able to contain water that right now would spill out and potentially make its way through neighborhoods trying to get back into a channel. And so right now for the projects that are moving to PER, the basins that we talked about with the limited channel, those are all in the upper portion of the main stem of Vince Bayou.
All right, thank you, Gary. And also to complete the other half of John's question, John also asked, are any projects being considered for the section south of Fairmont Parkway where there seems to be slower flow areas as well?
Again, the answer to that is we did identify other projects. I don't know right off the top of my head if there's something specifically at the Fairmont Parkway area, but we did identify other projects that didn't score out as well as the ones that are currently in PER. And so we're focused on providing projects that we can implement, construct them, build them, get them out into the ground with the available bond funding. And then we would try to circle back, in the coming years to try to figure out how do we continue to fund these other projects. I would encourage you to look at the feasibility report. There was a link provided earlier to our website, but that study report that's on our website kind of identifies some of the different projects that we identified in that phase of the study. But again, the ones that were moved forward to PER are the detention sites that we talked about today.
All right, thank you, Gary. Our next question for this evening is for Jonathan. Jonathan, why are the detention basins dry bottom?
Yeah, great question. That's always a hot topic as we start our discussions and meetings in the preliminary engineering stage. And really, there's several factors that go into deciding whether a basin is more advantageous as a wet bottom or a dry bottom basin. And it's one of the things that we look at in our preliminary engineering studies in this stage to weigh the options and look at different alternatives. Wet versus dry is one of those. Generally, we look at the shape and size of the basins, the depth and how a basin connects to the channel, things like soil type matter, the level of the water table, all things like that. We take that in and kind of weigh that information to figure out what's the best configuration of the basin. With all that said, in this watershed, really the biggest factor for us is the proximity to big airports. Both Hobby and Ellington are pretty close, and we have close coordination with the Houston airport system, and designing and building wet bottom basins in these areas close to these airports can be a hazard due to waterfowl. And so we decide when we're close enough to the airports to not construct something that could provide those attractants to waterfowl. So we keep it as a dry bottom so as to not have that wet feature in there.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. And for those of you who are just joining us tonight, I just want to remind everyone that there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project during tonight's session. You can submit a comment on this site in the box near the presentation live stream. You can submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/F104, or you can submit a comment via phone at 855-925-2801, utilizing meeting code 3872. If you are joining us via phone tonight, please press star to leave a message. All right, and moving on with our questions. Our next question is for David. David, will all 5 detention basins move forward to the next stage of work? David, you are muted.
Sorry. Apologize. Not necessarily. The 5 basins will all be evaluated in PER, but we have the potential to select a lesser number depending upon how the budgets work out. And we hope that all 5 can be built, but that will be determined as a part of the PER.
All right, thank you, David. Our next question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, Jose Luis is asking again, if the Flood Control District is aware that Pasadena is looking to build trails along Vince Bayou, and if the Flood Control District is currently in the process of land acquisitions.
So we are aware. Yep, we've discussed with City of Pasadena and talked to them about this project and others that we have. There's a big detention basin not too far to the south of here in the Armand Bayou watershed. That we've had those same kind of conversations with the City of Pasadena on. So, yep, we're aware of the trails, and we work with the City of Pasadena and other partners. Could be Harris County Precincts or City of Houston Parks Board, or in this area, Deer Park, City of LaPorte, City of Friendswood, other folks who do have a desire to build trails and other recreational features and amenities in and around our basins and projects. And so, yep, we're aware of that. We're working with them. As far as right-of-way acquisition or land acquisition goes, not quite there yet. Again, still working through the preliminary engineering report to figure out which properties, if any, may be needed to be acquired.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Our next question is for Gary. Gary, how is this project being funded, and how much will it cost ultimately?
Yes, the planning study we discussed in the presentation and the preliminary engineering stage that we're currently in and we've been talking about are both funded through the 2018 bond program. And so we don't know the entire cost of the project at this time. We have some rough estimates that we did at the planning stage, but one of the big purposes of the preliminary engineering stage is for the engineers to really start zooming in on potential tracks, looking, actually walking boots on the ground to look at the tracks, doing environmental. They get into a lot more detail than we can do at the planning side of things. And so as part of the PER, what they're trying to do is really evaluate everything in a lot more detail when we do the planning study, we're looking at the whole watershed and we're trying to identify where problems are. But now that we're at the PER stage, we have a series of recommendations that they will drill down into and start to identify better cost estimates and maybe ways to say, do we really need 5 basins? If we do this at this basin, maybe we can drop a basin and we get the same benefit. So all of that goes into the preliminary engineering stage. But the bond program set aside $15 million. So that's been our working budget. And that's when they go through the PER. At the end of that, they're going to have to take the available budget and identify what are the best projects or project components that can be added to try to stay within that particular budget. And then if we have additional items that we would like to do, those just go onto our future, project needs list or capital improvement program at some point in the future.
Thank you, Gary. Our next question is for David. David, will the construction of the detention basins impact homes along the bayou?
Thank you, Robert. Yes, they will in a beneficial way. The homes along the bayou are the most impacted by the flooding that is unable to be carried by the channel. So the homes along the bayou are the primary ones that benefit from the recommended detention and channel improvements. There are some impacts associated with construction, of course. There's dust and noise and potential environmental impacts in those areas, but those are temporary during construction, and we don't feel like there's the significant impacts that will be burdening these homeowners.
Thank you, David. This next question is also for you. Will the detention basin construction impact existing trails along Vince Bayou?
So the probably not. This is the simple answer. The current channel improvements are expected to be able to be accomplished within the existing right-of-way, and the detention basins, of course, have to be connected to the channel. So there's inlets and outlet facilities as shown on the slide that will have some temporary impacts to the channels, but that's really the primary impact.
Thank you, David. Our next question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, can you explain the benefits expected from the recommended improvements?
Sure. So based on the watershed planning study for the immediate recommended improvements, we're looking at about 5 miles of roadway and over 64 homes, which we would expect to be removed from flooding. And that is in a 1% chance or 100-year event. And at the beginning of the presentation, Gary talked through some of the nomenclature that we use to talk through a 100-year event or 1% chance. And so the benefits for those as determined in the planning study is about 64 homes or 5 miles of roadway. That said, many other structures will benefit from a reduced frequency of flooding, so a higher level of flooding. And these benefits and costs are going to be further refined during the PER phase. And so in the last couple of questions, we've talked through some of the things that we do in the PER phase. And one of those things is, like Gary said, get more into the details to fine tune exactly what the benefits are going to be.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next question is for Gary. Gary, how do you determine which recommendations move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really the primary purpose of the PER. Again, we began all this with a feasibility study to identify options. And during the PER phase, additional engineering analysis and environmental assessments are going to be conducted. And so all of this additional analysis is designed to provide a lot more detail and to get a better idea of the cost of all the different detention sites that we were trying to evaluate, as well as the recommendations for limited channel modifications. And so during this PER process, the engineers are actually looking at sites, they're looking at utilities, they're looking at pipelines that might be there that maybe we didn't pick up in our planning study. And so as they start adding all that in, they get a much better idea of what each of the different detention facilities could benefit and do. And then they also have a better idea of the cost. And so as they work through the PER, they're going to start looking at all of the components that we pushed forward, and they're going to select the ones where we get the most benefit in the watershed. Keeping in mind that we have a limited budget, you know, the 2018 bond provided $15 million, as we've previously discussed. And so they're going to take all of that together to say, okay, what can we actually construct? What are the benefits? And as they work through that and get more detail, they'll have future public engagement meetings that will provide a lot more details about where they're at and what the project's starting to look like. And as we work through the PER, then the next phase, as we talked about, would be going into construction, or excuse me, into design, and then ultimately construction. So at every step of that, we get more information, we have a better idea of what the project's going to look like until ultimately it gets constructed.
Thank you, Gary. Our next question is for David. David, will there be channel conveyance improvements at every detention basin? And how do you determine where channel conveyance improvements are needed?
So in the engineering PER process, we'll evaluate this in more detail. There was initially done as a part of the feasibility, and I'll answer the second part first. The channel conveyance is modeled using hydrologic and hydraulic, primarily hydraulic mathematical models to determine where they have limited capacity or need to be expanded. And not all of the detention areas have channel improvements recommended for them. The only, as Gary suggested, the only areas where the channel conveyance improvements are recommended are areas that are shown by the mathematical models to need additional capacity or additional conveyance, hydraulic capacity added to them. At all of the detention basins, as I said earlier, there are inlets and outlets that have to be connected to the channel, but the channel itself will not necessarily undergo any significant changes. All of that will be evaluated further in the PER process.
All right, thank you, David. Our next question is also for you, David. How long will it take to construct this project?
Well, that's really not determined at this state in any detail. That will also be a part of the PER process to evaluate the property acquisitions, the utility relocations, any environmental mitigation, environmental permits required, and that will establish more than anything the length of time that this entire process will take. Construction itself is typically a one-year process, but again, that's too early to tell because there may be complications of moving utilities or dealing with unexpected underground conditions that have to be evaluated. So all of that, as I said, is subject to the PER team's recommendations.
All right, Thank you, David. Our last question of the evening is for Gary. Gary, if Vince is primarily in the city of Pasadena, why was coordination with the city of Houston necessary during the planning study?
Yes, the simplest answer to that is that when we did the watershed planning study, we were looking at the entire Vince Bayou watershed. And there's a small portion of Vince near the ship channel and in the upper part of the watershed that is within the city of Houston's jurisdiction. So when we were doing that study, we tried to make sure we were coordinating with any potential future partners, trying to see if any of them have any specific information or data and things that we could use in our study. And so the reason we coordinated with the city was just very clearly because there are city limits within the limits of the watershed.
All right, thank you, Gary. And with that, I would like to share one final reminder that the comment period associated with this meeting runs through March 23rd, but we're always looking for your input and engagement. We also encourage everyone to get flood insurance as flood season in Harris County runs year-round. Thank you again for joining us this evening and for providing your input on this project. We look forward to continuing to share updates as our work moves forward. Stay safe and have